Hello, everybody. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1206th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Sampada Aranke, Michelle Kuo, Adam Pendleton, David Reed, and Richard Shiff, who will all be talking about Jack Whitten on the occasion of the brilliant exhibition Jack Whitten the Messenger on view now at Museum of Modern Art in New York. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Sampada Aranke is an associate professor of art history and comparative studies at Ohio State University and a contributor to the accompanying publication for Jack Whitten the Messenger. Michelle Kuo is chief curator at large and publisher at the Museum of Modern Art. She led the curatorial team for Jack Whitten the Messenger and leads interdisciplinary work on temporary and collection exhibitions, digital initiatives, research and scholarship, and acquisitions for the museum's collection, and directs MoMA's Global Publications Program. Adam Pendleton, a central figure in contemporary American painting, continuously redefines the medium as it relates to process and abstraction. Pendleton's exhibition Love Queen opened earlier this month at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden and will be on through January 2027. Pendleton has called Jack Whitten one of the giants of abstract painting and conceptual art. Preoccupied with reinventing the process of painting, artist David Reed manipulates the forms and associations of the brushstroke to foreground an unresolved tension between the gestural and the systematic. Reed first met Whitten in the 1970s and got to know him when Reed and art historian Katie Siegel organized High Times, Hard Times, New York Painting 1967 to 1975 in 2006-2007. You can read Reed's Ode to Jack Whitten in the 2018 journal Tribute to Whitten, which we'll post in the chat. And our host today, Richard Shiff, is the Effie Marie Kane Regents Chair in Art at the University of Texas at Austin, where he directs the Center for the Study of Modernism. In 2022, Shiff published Jack Whitten, Cosmic Soul, a monograph informed by Whitten's writings and extensive conversations between Whitten and Shiff. Shiff has also contributed to the publication for Jack Whitten the Messenger. And with that, and with tremendous gratitude to our guest today, I will pass it over to Richard to get us started.
Thanks, Chloe. I want to begin with a couple of questions for Michelle, put the show together with her team. I assume that, Michelle, that you probably had more works. There may have been works that you wanted and couldn't get, but I'm assuming that you had more available to you as potential for the exhibition, more than you could handle in the space, even though it's very commodious and beautiful. First question is, what was hardest to eliminate? Something that you kind of wanted or very much wanted to be in the show and realized it couldn't fit in. And the second question would be, what was your motivation to integrating the works on paper with the paintings and sculptures in the way that you did?
Thank you so much, Richard, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining. It's exciting to talk about this, and just for context, I will say that in the database of Whitten works, which includes really everything, almost like even small scraps of paper, et cetera, tiny drawings or notes, but that's almost 5,000 entries. And the exhibition at MoMA, even though it's extremely commodious, as you say, it's very large scale, we were able to include about 175 works or items, and that includes archival material. So to narrow that list down was, over the process of maybe 4 to 5 years, that was excruciating. It was really difficult. And so, of course, what you're putting forward in something like this is a tiny subset of the output that Jack Whitten created during his lifetime. He also, as you know, destroyed works throughout his lifetime as well. If he didn't like something and he thought it was not successful, He did not let it remain. And sometimes he also reused canvases or thought about redeploying materials that he had because he didn't waste a thing. So all that to say, it was very difficult to choose. I'm proud to say that we actually got pretty much everything we wanted to get, maybe with the exception of one or two works, and there are loans from all over the world, from private collections, from institutions, but also, of course, from the estate. And I would say one aspect, you're looking at this screenshot right now of the installation. I will say that two gigantic galleries in the retrospective exhibition are devoted to just about 3 or 4 years, from 1970 to 1974. So that does show our hand a little bit, which is that we really loved this moment where Whitten in 1970 invents one of his signal devices, the developer, which we'll talk about more in this conversation today, and just is innovating at light speed in a very compressed amount of time. And just to devote that amount of space to about 4 years of his career was obviously a choice, but it was something that we felt was really illuminating at this pivotal moment in his career. And then it does actually dovetail with your second question, which is about integrating media. And you'll see this kind of scaffolding structure. There's a sculpture that's roughly contemporaneous. Again, just for context, if he made almost 5,000 works in his lifetime, Jack Whitten made about 45 to 50 sculptures in his lifetime. So again, those sculptures, we wanted to kind of complement the works. But you'll see here in this exhibition shot, there are tray cases that we integrated into this kind of light scaffolding structure because we wanted to show many works on paper in addition, as well as archival materials, even his small tools and letters and notes, in tandem with the paintings. And you'll see how they kind of fold in on one another. When you go through the show, you don't see a linear narrative. You don't see a kind of linear enfilade that's shooting you through some sort of progression. You see all of these almost sliding doors and a kind of simultaneity of different chronologies happening in one time. This large space you're looking at right now represents about 1975 to 1985 and works in all media. And the horizontality of those tray cases was a way to really draw emphasis to drawings and works on paper. They're on the wall upright as well, but because so many of his works on paper mimic or actually enact the horizontality of his process in painting as well. During this period for decades, he was just working on his studio floor or on tables or trays. The works on paper as well, that's almost not a great way of describing them because he's experimenting with as many, if not more, materials on paper. His wife, Mary Whitten, is a paper conservator. He writes an essay that's called Why I Work on Paper. And the first sentence of that essay is, paper is alive. He's dousing it in water. He's doing all of these things to paper, and he's treating it as a material substance that, again, is often taking place on a horizontal surface. So that's another way and reason that we wanted to incorporate all of these different media together. They're also sculptural as well, just like his actual three-dimensional sculptures in the round. His works in acrylic paint are often sculpting with paint, and his works on paper are often deploying incredible and unorthodox materials in a sculptural way.
So that's wonderful, Michelle. Oh, you mentioned so many things that are interesting. His not wasting anything. He used studio dust in some of the paintings. The dust being primarily tiny fragments of acrylic that fell to the floor, and he would sweep it up and then reuse it. And the wave motif that shows up in some of the works in paper, as you said, from wetting the paper, applying sometimes powdered pigment that becomes a liquid when the paper is wet, and then letting the paper dry, pressing it, produces the wave. And then in painting, he would do it with putting a little shimmy into the squeegee on a very large scale. So in paper, you get this idea of the wave, which for him was related to quantum physics and all kinds of things. You get it at a small scale, and then you get it in gigantic, really, scale. So, but I should turn this over to our panelists and ask maybe just general impressions of the exhibition or impressions of Jack Whitten. Or what might be the standout quality for you of the work or of the person?
I'll say I love the title of this show, Michelle.
Thank you.
It's a great title, and really says so much about Jack. I keep thinking, what is a messenger? And I wrote a few things down, and it's someone who's smart, hardworking, but also knows how to be in the right place at the right time. And I've just been reading about the 9/11 experience, how Jack was there and saw the first plane hitting the tower and the shower of shards of glass. It's amazing that he could be there. And when you see the video of that plane hitting, which we all have been seeing over and over again through the years, there's Jack's voice in the background saying a phrase of Jack's, "Holy shit," he says. And it just amazes me every time I hear it. How did he have that ability? What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think, on the messenger, how did he have that ability? It was like clued in to the world, really. I mean, in so many different ways. I think of the messenger or a messenger as someone who's somehow future oriented. I think when Jack was producing his various kinds of work, he was well aware that his contemporaries were mystified by what he was doing, thought it was a little crazy, each thing that he did. And yet, eventually people pick up on it and realize that it's all very prescient. It somehow relates. I mean, I think he thought of his work as relating to the past and the future at the same time. And there he was in the present, but he was very conscious of being on a kind of eternal timeline and connecting to the history of art from the very beginning and somehow projecting his work into the future. But let's hear from others about their impressions.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for having me. This question, Richard, that you set up for us is so generous and beautiful because it allows us to kind of be with Jack Whitten in real time. And I was, I was really taken by Michelle, you and your team's ability to really capture the way that his work kind of invites for a very intimate kind of like looking practice. And those first few choices, right, when you step into the gallery, the reveal for me behind that wall of Birmingham, 1964, which is, such a beautiful, intimate little piece of work that is so gripping and phenomenal. I mean, it's like gravity, that piece for me. It kind of like sucks you right into the wall. And being in the space with people and having people have this kind of shocked moment, to go to look behind the wall and then to be invited in was such a beautiful gesture. And I think, for me, it was moving not only because of the kind of history we're living through in this moment in real time, but also because how it captured a certain kind of generosity in Jack's practice. Whether he's working in that scale or these giant monumental pieces, there's this really kind of cheeky and kind invitation and like reflexivity around the viewer as being a part of making the timeline of the work, whether it's past or future, Richard, to your point. So it felt like, he was everywhere, not only in his hand and his vision, but also just in that awareness of what it means to like be with art, and to have it be an active agent in the way that we experience the world, and this piece especially, maybe it's for selfish reasons because I've been obsessed with this piece for a little while now.
Well,
But
I'll plug that Sam wrote an amazing essay for the catalog about this piece and another work from 64. And Richard wrote a beautiful essay looking into time, actually, in Whitten's work for the catalog as well. Yes, this is the other work that Sampada wrote about.
yeah. So I was, I'm gripped by, thank you, Michelle. I was just really taken by how that invitation and that gesture of like the viewer being very, very kind of conscious about the world that he made, not only in these discrete objects, but also the atmosphere around the objects. It was just such a beautiful gesture to be with those works in that space.
Thank you.
Adam, you have some thoughts?
I do. Thanks for the prompt, Richard. Like everyone, delighted to be here to talk about this extraordinary exhibition and an extraordinary artist. And so thank you, Michelle, for spending 4 or 5 years working on this so that these conversations can occur and these deep reflections on his work and contributions to culture and philosophy, material and science and painting can be revisited here in the present. I mean, so Jack was, and I also want to say is an anachronistic innovator. And what's so striking about him is it was across so many different modes and methods. Yes, he was a painter, but he was also a philosopher. He was also a kind of scientist. He was also, I would even argue, a kind of musician. He was also an incredible writer. So when I saw this show, I was actually very sad, quite honestly, because it became so immediately obvious that during the entire arc of his life, he was never recognized for the full breadth of his contributions. And so I kind of walked through the show with a sort of a melancholic mood, but also, of course, a feeling of jubilation that finally this show was being staged and realized. And I also realized having seen so many Whitten exhibitions and galleries and museums around the world, I had just never grasped the depth of his facility with all mediums: sculpture, painting, space, light, time. And I started to think about a peer of his, Sam Gilliam, who also had an amazing moment of innovation around the same time as Jack with his drape paintings. And I thought back to the show I saw of Sam's at the Kunstmuseum and Basel, which focused on works from 1967 to 1973. So of course the Drake paintings. And I had a similar feeling when I was moving through the Sam Gilliam exhibition of an artist who had completely blown open a medium and had also, I would argue, during the course of his lifetime, also never been fully recognized for his achievements. And another reason why I became melancholic, because my hope is that, there's been a lot of rethinking of our historical canons that we've created over the past decade or so. And I think people tire of this work. So I think it is striking, Michelle, that you were working on this show for 4 or 5 years, because, and Julie touches on this in her text in the book. Are we coming to the end of a cycle where another generation, another group of artists will be ignored because it's not where the culture is? It's not what people want to look at. It's not what people want to think about or talk about. Or will we continue to do this important work and make sure that people are seen and recognized for what is so obviously a massive achievement?
Thank you. And I would just say really quickly that, what's amazing is that when we do walkthroughs of the shows these days, everyone will always ask, like, did he have assistants? Did Jack did he have a team, et cetera? And I said, no. And that is one thing I will say that is deeply extraordinary, that he labored in this way. It's not that he had no recognition, of course, and that he had shows and he would show at galleries from time to time, et cetera. But he was so devoted to his practice and also the scale and ambition of a work like The Pariah Way, already early in 73, but then, of course, 9/11 and the Atopolis work, to have that scale and ambition when you don't really have, it's not like he has, this huge audience or market. To have that dedication, he's doing it for other painters. And Glenn Ligon actually had a great sort of observation reading his diary, because for many of you who know this, Jack Whitten kept an almost daily studio log. And he's writing down everything from his philosophical musings to kind of manifestos to, describing his process, even though it's still hard to know exactly how he did what he did. And he's writing all of these journal entries. And Glenn Ligon was saying it's very interesting to read those now and think about who was he writing them for, because the voice is very specific. And Glenn said, I wonder if he was writing them for us today, like he was writing for the future. And I love that aspect of it. There is this proleptic quality to what he was doing, and to Richard's point as well. So maybe that's a bit more of a hopeful spin on this, but he did what he did, and he did it, throughout for almost 60 years. And that's what's also so incredible.
Katie Siegel, in the little afterword to the publication, called it a gift to artists, that Jack left the journal as a gift to artists and to readers in general. Michelle, I have a quick question for you that came to mind when the image of the self-portrait with the sunglasses was on the screen. And it's a painting that you have to smile at when you see it. It's a little bit of a sort of a joke, a game that he's playing there. And you hung it on a side, what is essentially a sidewall that is peripheral to the passage of the visitor. And I wonder, what struck me was, yeah, that painting, you see it out of the corner of your eye and you have to stop. And the fact that it's not directly facing you at first contributes to the surprise of it. I wonder if you were thinking along those lines.
Definitely. And, of course, it's easy to also ascribe very high intentions to some hangs when sometimes you're also just like, I have to figure out how to, fit these things in the space. But I will say definitely that work felt like, speaking of, and I don't know if we can actually go to that slide, but that work is an acrylic tile work from 2008, and the eyes are little actual sunglass lenses. So it's an actual collage. And yeah, exactly. You see this view as you exit into a kind of larger arena of works. And what's amazing about that piece is that it really is a kind of sidelong glance. Like I think he's there's a great book about American art history called Looking Askance, but Jack Whitten, I think, was both looking into the future. The future is so bright. He's got to wear shades, but also I wanted that feeling. We wanted that feeling of when you're, you think you're about to leave the exhibition. Wait, there's more. And then also it's like a sly kind of coy look at you, almost daring you to say like, did you see what you just saw? And of course, he only made a handful of self-portraits in his lifetime. And this as a self-portrait is also just incredible. It's that kind of masked identity. To me, it's almost one of the most David Hammons-esque works that Jack Whitten ever made. And the other thing that's so interesting about it is you can see here, and we'll get into this later, he made this work primarily out of tiles of acrylic paint. He would lay down slabs starting in about 1990, yet another one of about 10 innovative processes that he invented in his lifetime. He laid down slabs of acrylic paint and then let them dry or harden and then slice them into tiles so that he could create absolutely sort of dumbfounding mosaics out of them, not out of stone or ceramic, but out of paint. Dried paint. And then the title of this piece is actually Self-Portrait, Entrainment. And the word entrainment, I guess, is about the phenomenon of two systems when they come into interaction with each other. And you can almost see here the tiles have been arrayed around each sunglass lens, almost like an owl, but they're organic, right? It's like when you drop a pebble in a pool of water and those ripples cascade out, but then it's coming into contact with another system of waves or water. And of course, the interaction between black and white here is very poignant as well. So this idea of an individual caught between a system and their own internal agency, that's what I see when I look at this work. And it to me, it was like a coda as well for the show.
Thinking of the many innovations in Jack's work and your remarks about how you chose to give so much space to the early 70s, the developer works of various kinds. I wonder what everybody, our thoughts would be about the significance of those works and how they might relate to an electronic environment, which is, both photography and screen imagery, early digital imagery. Those things were on Jack's mind in those years. How do those paintings look now? Maybe David, you want to?
Well, they look very prescient. He was dealing with issues that in advance of other people and doing it in a more profound and thoughtful way. I'm in awe of how far ahead he was of just about everyone else.
I mean, he's very much so creating the screen and also blurring it at the same time.
Yeah.
So he's using the deployment of material as an invitation to exist within the context of a blur. And like in many of the works, asking the audience to, or asking himself, doesn't really matter, I would say, to question what emerges from the blur. Is it is it an opacity or is it a kind of clarity? And I think it's also all this question around purpose whenever you develop a tool or a technology? What is the purpose behind it? And he created these kind of poetic dimensions to answer those questions around agency and purpose, and how they relate back to technology, and really painting as a kind of technology that allows the interpretation in the experience of the world to be made manifest.
This is why I love sharing space with artists. I mean, it is like, Adam, your comments just really raised for me the way that those paintings, I don't think I'd always thought about them in relation to this like investigation around the evidentiary mandate of photography, like this demand that the photograph was like a reflection of some kind of social documentary like impulse, that the photograph somehow captured something real that painting couldn't. So then there's a way that the investigation, right, like, or that the developer throws that into crisis. But your comment is helping me think about, and of course, like for me, that's all that has a bunch of weight on it around thinking about his relationship and his kind of meditation on race specifically, and how the history of photography is so, wedded and entangled with the violences of capture and captivity, and, the ways that, to be Black in this world and to be photographed has just an undue burden placed on it. So I always kind of had that when I was thinking about not only the invention of the developer, but also the use of it. But you're also helping me think about like the blur might also be a way to like open up another portal, like back to being like a messenger, like opening up this way that because it's so hard to figure out like what's in front and what's in back in those images, like what, in your eye, I don't know about everybody else, but my eye is always straining. Like it moves so quickly when I'm looking at those paintings, I don't really know where to settle. And then all of a sudden, like there's these pockets, like I think it's in Delacroix's palette or something. There's like this pocket of like this, all these colors coming together, and there's like this hole that it's almost like a peephole that you can kind of look into, but you don't know if you're looking through it or in front of it or what's going on. And that, your comment on like the blur and the kind of purpose of the tool to maybe crack open another dimension, right, is really where I'm like, oh, maybe that's what those paintings are also about, not just this kind of investigation around like what can painting do after photography, but like he's messenger. He's like collapsing all sorts of like cosmos all into this one plane. There's something else that's more existential going on that I had missed until you just offered us that.
I think that, Adam, do you want to?
Oh, just quickly to respond to her. It's also that the material in the tool are the way to go beyond the limits of the body in all ways, intellectually, physically, etc. And that the blur is clarity, and the blur is, and then you have to think about labor as a kind of obstacle or motivating factor, which I think is also interesting to think about.
So I was, for me, blur is very often a sign of, well, and certainly in electronics, it is a sign of interference. And it's a sign that Jack is always doing at least two things at the same time. And so there is the screen, the parallel lines, but the parallel lines are never perfect. And they're sometimes imperfect because there's a kind of shimmy in them. And sometimes they're imperfect because of variable pressure on the surface. And sometimes because he's placed objects underneath the canvas, which are creating a kind of bump, which gets recorded in the interference pattern. So part of the image is coming up from underneath, part of it is coming from above where he is. It's this combination of forces that are operating in different directions, different modes.
Yeah, I wondered if we could actually go to some of those slides, but to the 70s works or to Head, because what's amazing is that to my mind, they're literally fugitive. They're fugitive images, and yet they're also incredibly material. Like the plastic quality of the acrylic paint is rupturing and tearing, almost like elastic or bubble gum. And that's how you get these apertures onto those layers below that you mentioned, Sam, and that Richard, you've written about, so beautifully as well. And yeah, Adam, to your point, like I just think it's this unbelievable way of creating a kind of on the one hand refusal of a legible image or illustration, on the other hand it's so palpable, and whether it's something that evokes television interference or screen lines, or earlier works that are here you see the actual ripples of water. This is the work that it looks like an image of water or an electron microscope image, but the ripples are actually created by soaking this piece of paper in water. Or other pieces that are paintings that evoke like the cold or hot rolled steel in the steel industrial landscape around him growing up in Alabama, or the iron ore quarries, or the coal mines. And he's thinking about all of those sense memories as well. And he says, one of his great quotes is that memory is trapped in the material. And that's kind of what I think of a lot when you're talking about these works.
In the case of works which have where the primary direction is vertical for the raster of lines, if you look at those paintings from the side, or maybe, not a whole 90 degrees around, although you can do that, but maybe 45 degrees around, it becomes all the more dimensional. And it made me think that in some of those works, Jack was getting the effect of a Jesus Rafael Soto relief, and he was doing it on what is really quite a flat surface, and getting an amazing amount of dimensionality. And now we've got on the screen something that Sam was referring to, where I think the pressure that's being applied is so great on Jack's part that the surface breaks, and elements that are underneath are revealed in what for him would have been, I think, an unpredictable way, so that it either looks good or it doesn't look good. And that would, if it didn't look good, that would be one of the failures. He'd break it up, reuse the parts. This on the screen right now is something I saw in the studio right when he had unrolled it. It had been rolled up for like 30 or maybe even 40 years, probably about 40 years, and he hadn't seen it. And it's an amazing work. I'm so glad you were able to include this, Michelle.
Yes.
It's just, for me, it's just amazing what he did there. I think he was using what's called a Dremel point, and probably doing it in segments out from the center. And so you get that variation in the color as it moves out from the center or in toward the center, however you want to think of it.
Yeah, you can't see it here quite, but it's a sort of almost like a compass. It's all very small ridges. He had clearly a grooved, like carpenter saw or hand. Oh, here, perfect. So, but it's so perfect and yet so material. It's a little bit like an Eva Hesse piece. You don't exactly know how he did it, but yeah, Richard, he's often using these devices as well, like a compass point or a plumb line or other kinds of tools like that to essentially create these grooves, almost like a record spinning. But this blew my socks off. So it was amazing that you saw that, Richard, in the studio as well.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, it was he had just stretched it. And it was new to him. He'd kind of forgotten about it. Um, just and of course, he was a master carpenter and very familiar with all of the tools. So that facilitated the ideas that he had. He could figure out a way to do something that he had envisaged.
Are are there any great painters who were not innovators?
That's a damn good question. I'll bet there were. Uh, I'll bet there were, but maybe they're not of interest to us. They're great without being interesting.
I will say, and now I told this story a bunch of times, but installing the show, like 3 weeks, you're installing, and the art handlers who are all amazing and brilliant, many of them artists themselves. First of all, they did say like every day was like Christmas. Like they would open a crate and say like, "Oh my God, it's another amazing work." And then they said, "Did he invent everything?" Because it's like, did other artists know about him? Because it's almost like he invented everything. So of course, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but I do think Whitten is I mean, it's exponentially striking how many different kinds of innovations he sort of went through. And of course, in relation to other artists, exploring and experimenting at the same time. But in the context of what he was doing, this work I think is interesting because it's an early work. It's still gestural. It's like this kind of apocalyptic scene, but you'll notice the curved black frame, which makes it seem like you're looking at the whole thing through a television set. So thinking about Vietnam and civil rights demonstrations unfolding, he's always looking at history as mediated.
There's one work that I had never seen, Michelle, and I don't know who would have seen it. I don't know how sort of buried it was, but it's the one which is hung at an angle, but I believe it's a square canvas. You
Yes.
know what I'm referring to.
Yes.
And it is in one of the installation shots that it would be the room that has 9/11 in it, but it's on the opposite wall.
Yes. You'll see it's hanging up high in a little it's like I think you have to go to the end, but it's from 1992 and it's called Stealth Square for Julius Tobias. And oh yeah, there you go.
There it
Slide
is.
64 or 65, either one. So it's there hanging up top. And what you can't see here is that it's almost like a Malevich. It's like made out of acrylic tiles, but it's black on black. So there's actually a very distinct pattern or shapes that are in that what looks like a monochromatic black square. And it's reflective and absorptive and matte at the same time. And what he used is apparently the black paint that was used for the B-2 stealth bomber. For those of you growing up, in the 90s, it was this crazy sort of symbol of Defense Department sort of excess, but also this new type of plane, military plane that could evade radar detection. And so that kind of radar absorbing military grade paint, here you see it a bit distorted here from Parallax, he infused that into the acrylic paint tiles that he created and got this like very interesting type of blackness. And he was obsessed with different kinds of black pigment. On the right, you actually see a piece called Totem for Amadou Diallo, which is heartbreaking, but he also made it out of acrylic paint tiles. It is almost cross-like shape on the far right, but for that piece, he used Spinel black, which for a long time was the blackest pigment known to humans, except now it's been superseded by Vanta black. So he was an alchemist, tinkering around with these materials and sort of, chemical infusions into the paint. into the pigment. And just as a side note as well, again, you totally can't see it here, but that's why you have to come to the show and see it in person. I always bust out an iPhone flashlight. The oval piece on the left in this wall is called Dark Mirror for Roy Lichtenstein, also from around 1990. And there, the acrylic tiles are like glass. They're like obsidian. They're so shiny. And I don't know if any of you remarked on this as you were looking at the show as well, but just those three different kinds of absorptive and but also extremely reflective types of black he infused in those pieces. I don't know if that was something, Richard, you were also, perceiving.
I'm watching the time, and I want to ask one last question of everyone before we turn to Q&A in a few minutes. I mean, we do have some time for some discussion, but if we could go back to the previous slide, which has more of that, more of that room. It raises our awareness of Jack's experimentation with formats. So we've got the square painting, which is hung at an angle, and as in the slide here, the image, depending on where you're standing, you don't see it as a square. Then we've got the Diallo work, which is low relief, where there are a lot of works like this where Jack took pieces of wood, some very often found pieces, and put them together to make a format. Then we've got the oval. Then to the left, we've got the the unstretched canvas with an irregular shape, which is, I think, made up of several fragments of canvas pieced together. And there are a number of works like that. And then we've got three works to the left, which are more conventional. But I do find the coloration of the ones that are dedicated to Jack's parents at the extreme left, those two, strange, because there's it's not a normal kind of black and white. It's a strange quality. So I mean, maybe everybody might comment on the appearance of this room. And then, of course, there's a sculptural piece as well. Sam, do you want to begin?
Sure. This room is another one where I just felt like my jaw kind of dropped. I mean, because I couldn't actually make sense of what was going on because I had been so prepped and primed to look at like squares and look at them in terms of how they're kind of how they're exploding at the level of like material and form in each room. And then when I got in here, like all of my grounding was taken out and I was so thrilled, it felt like floating a little bit. For me, the thing that really gets me is this kind of these three super black, these experimentations with like black, right? One thing that I left with in this particular room is the way that Jack was thinking about the demands of history and the citations of history, and how art is so constitutive of those citations. Thinking for me, like thinking about memorial, thinking of memory, thinking of like legacy and genealogy in these three works specifically, on the wall. I was just kind of blown away at the way that he is citing, like making all these kinds of art historical nods in the work, while also maintaining a certain kind of commitment to the integrity of what the color black is and can mean in the most expansive sense of the term. The way that you can see yourself in it, the way that it forces you to kind of see yourself outside of it, the way that figures like Malevich and Lichtenstein had taken for granted all of its, abundant generosity as a color, or had even kind of foreclosed that generosity as a color. The way that like the color Black is integral to how we think about grief. And that has a loaded and open history, right? In the Diallo piece. So I spent like probably 40 minutes just in front of this wall because I was in my on my runaway train because of him. So I'll just end it there. But the capaciousness of what it means to think with the color Black, which Adam is, also, your work for me is an open invite in that way. And the writings of somebody like Adrian Edwards has so kind of generously helped me think about that and at different levels. But this wall to me was just like, whoa, this has another level, adds another level to that history and to that exploration with the color.
It's such a dangerous a game to play, this dwelling in this Black space, because then what happens is people start telling you what it is, which is sort of the opposite. That's not the point of the gambit, at least not for me. But I say that in the sense that, using a concept or a device like Black Dada, what then happens is people start telling you what Black Dada is or isn't, and which is its own kind of confusion when it's only ever a refusal. And I think it's interesting to think about this idea of the refusal work in relationship to Jack Whitten, the refusal of limits, but also the embrace of contradiction. And so, and I actually mean that from a formal standpoint, because it's very interesting to like, and particularly when you think of like the Black monolith paintings, unless you're very well versed in his work, I think you could be shown one from any year and not really kind of know what, if it was the 80s or the 90s, so there's actually this incredible through line. And I love this contradiction because it's almost like he's saying everything changes, but nothing changes. And there's something overwhelming and generative about that position and approach to making everything but nothing. And, there's also this, even if you look at this room, but there's this, I can't help but think he's also saying abstraction is representation and representation is abstraction. Like he's clearly not interested in delineating or making any kind of clean distinctions between what is and what isn't. And there's something related to that about not using paint as paint too is also a kind of refusal. I'm not going to use it in this way. I'm going to use it like this. And so there, in other words, there is no illusion. It is what it is. And I love in Michelle's essay when she talks about the image and the speed of images. And painting, of course, is about these different kind of temporal realities. That is, in fact, what we encounter when we stand in front of a painting are temporal realities. And the beauty of a painting, the beauty of Jack's work is that it's the confluence of these temporal realities that ultimately overwhelm us and encourage and provoke deep looking, deep thinking, and even deep listening.
David, do you want to add to what we've heard?
I was caught, Richard, by the wonderful dedication to Julius Tobias in the painting. He was an older minimalist painter that was around Soho, so Jack would have known him, I'm sure. And
Yes.
it's a very generous thing to do. And I'm moved to hear that he isn't thinking just about, I don't know, young artists or important artists. He's thinking about all the artists. And it's a very special painting to me because of that.
Yeah, he so often dedicated his works, really almost more than any other artist I know of, to other people. And as you're saying, David, that included friends, other artists that, today we may not have heard of, but that were really important to Whitten at the time. But also, of course, historic figures and his mother and father, as you noted, Richard, in those two works on the left. And as Adam and Sam have been so beautifully sort of describing, I think what's amazing about those works actually on that left-hand wall is that you can't see it here, and there's a very colorful one in the middle, but dedicated to Thelonious Monk. But the far right is a piece called Natural Selection. It's on that kind of unstretched, strange canvas, but you can see a figure there, and it's on the flip side, it's almost like an unmarked grave. I mean, it has this kind of quality to it. On the left, that diptych is dedicated to his mother, the seamstress, his father, the coal miner, and the titles of those are actually fifth and sixth Gestalt, respectively. So he's literally playing on this idea that there's a kind of figure that isn't a figure. Is it a positive or negative space? And I would just note that those works, all three of those works, are made with these curious acrylic tiles into which are infused sumi ink. He was really interested in sumi ink and used sumi ink in lots of works on paper as well. But you see the ink literally floating as if trapped in amber in each of those acrylic tiles. So again, it's just kind of this mind-blowing way of thinking about how the material itself is embodying something or capturing something that's fugitive, and that time elapse. Like literally you can see like wisps of material floating through, but now trapped in this kind of medium. It is really just gorgeous. And the other thing I would say about the piece on the right that you began with, Richard, I didn't actually answer your question, but again, to Adam and Sam and David's points too, that work for the stealth square for Julius Tobias is hung that way because Whitten, made the hanging hardware that way. Like it's supposed to look like a bit of a B-2 bomber, like a spaceship or a plane, a high-tech plane lifting off and of course flying into space. And yet it is super heavy. That thing is like a very constructed, like wooden thing with these acrylic tiles on it in this very absorptive, dense, at the time, this crazy high-tech pigment that we don't even really know exactly how we got a hold of it. Apparently Kramer Paints had, called him and said, I got this thing in stock. Don't you want to try it? So just this idea of something that was at the forefront of essentially the military industrial complex. Jack treats it with this not only humor, lightheartedness, dedication to a friend, another painter, but also this idea that it is actually very heavy. It has the weight. It has this weight to it that's dragging it down.
So Michelle, you answered my question about the color of the diptych. So it's the sumi ink that creates that. It's not a normal blackness.
No. And yeah, so many layers to unpack there, but exactly there you see it as well in the natural selection piece. And there's surely other pigments in it as well, but yeah, the diptych you see, also the acrylic tiles themselves have an irregular surface. They almost look crystalline. So there's something else going on in those works that's super interesting.
Yeah, and that there's something else going on in those works. That applies to every damn one of these things. There's
That was our other
always something
title of
going
our
on.
show.
Yeah. I'm going to it's 1:00. I'm going to turn this over to Chloe now for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Richard, David, Sam, Adam, Michelle. This has been an absolute pleasure to listen to, and I'm really grateful to all of you for this conversation today. We have so many audience questions to get through. I'll try to get through as many as I can. And if you haven't submitted a question at the link in the chat, feel free to. The first question is from an anonymous audience member who says, Gilliam had many assistants, but Jack Whitten's world was directed by inner voices, his reciprocity as an educator, and deep consciousness towards materials. What do you think he might be pursuing if he were still with us? And what clues did he leave with you as friends and curators?
That's a great question. I often wonder, but I've never come up with a decent answer. Did someone else have an answer?
Richard, do you?
Oh, we've lost Richard.
Oh,
Too
no.
bad. He might be the one who would know.
I would just say quickly, he did leave some unfinished works. We have the last work that he made in the exhibition, but he was still exploring his acrylic tile compositions. But I don't know. He probably would have invented 5 other different ways of creating work between now and then. And that's what's so interesting. He was constantly experimenting, not just for the sake of experimentation, but I honestly again, not to be too highfalutin, but there's a great quote of a quote, I'll leave it there, in George Lewis's essay in the catalog for the show, which is that, this very specific type of experimentation that Whitten was pursuing is not about the mastery of form, but about the deformation of mastery. And that really sticks with me. And I'm sure maybe, yeah, Adam, you're nodding because I know that resonates with a lot of what you're thinking about too.
Absolutely. I'm curious what other people would have deserved monoliths, black monoliths,
Yeah.
if he had kept going. I also kept sitting here thinking, and this is kind of a way backwards way into answering the question. So after I saw the Whitten show, I went down to the contemporary galleries and saw the Richard Serra sculptures. The title I can't remember. Equal. Yes, thank you, Michelle. And I thought about Richard's Verb List, which I think is also in MoMA's collection.
Yes.
Which is such an amazing work of art to bend, to fold, to drop, to, basically any verb. And then you can just think of any material. And then, it occurred to me that in some ways, Richard stopped experimenting, but Jack kind of enacted that verb list. Like he actually exercised those principles throughout the entire arc of his career, which seems like such a strange word to use, career, but throughout the entire arc of his making, and really making the case, if you're trapped, and I do experiment, if you're trapped, experiment with form, with time, with material, with history. And I do believe that, and I think it's interesting to problematize and think through this concept of being trapped and how experimentation relates to that physical or psychological state of being culturally trapped, imprisoned, cut off, limited, and to use that disposition as a possibility instead of a limit.
That's amazing. And I'm sure Sam and David and others could speak to this too, because I think Whitten, first of all, he must have been inspired by the Verb List because he also was making his own throughout all those decades. So all those journal studio logs are filled with these lists. My favorite is in the show, also in the book, but it's to avoid at all costs. It's not to do, but it's what to avoid. And number 11 is other artists. But anyway, it's really hilarious. So, but he's also constantly thinking about freedom, and he writes endlessly about this. That's why jazz is so, I think, formative for him. But he's often saying like, you need to expand consciousness in order to find a new kind of freedom. And Adam, you just put it so beautifully, which is I think he's seeing how there's a lot of rhetoric around freedom and obviously, of course, actual struggles for freedom around him over, 50 plus years. And yet he is trying to look for yet another way, some other form of freedom that he doesn't see actually embodied or enacted in the world around him. It's not through, he's fascinated by technology and science and other worlds, but he doesn't quite see how that has manifested itself. He even talks about very early on the way that we're overloaded or inundated with information, and how are we going to find ourselves, a way out of that. And that's like, he writes that in the 70s. So again, he's seeing all of these aspects of what purportedly are paths to freedom, or a kind of liberatory, what will liberate us. And he's saying, yeah, I haven't seen it yet. Like, I don't quite see it yet. Like, that's what he's searching for.
What a beautiful way to think about Jack's paintings, just to be brief, as forms of freedom.
Honestly, I think, yeah.
Great. Wow.
It's
Thank
very
you all.
moving.
Yeah, thank you all so much for those answers, and thank you, anonymous audience member, for that really generative question. Our next question is from Yana Kim. Yana, I'm going to give you a chance to unmute if you'd like to ask your question directly, or I can ask it on your behalf.
Oh yeah, I didn't know I would get that yeah opportunity. So I was actually wondering about the medium line. Like, as we just spoke of a lot of like mixed materials in addition to the acrylic materials. I was actually wondering what were the like a discussion around the medium line, because like on many of the Black Monolith series, we put acrylic on canvas. Was it to, yeah, I just want to hear about like your discussion, like an ongoing or long-term discussion around the medium line.
Well, I'll just again thank the family and the estate, and also, of course, the curatorial team and researchers throughout time immemorial, because the medium lines, as you know, the other theme of the show could have been, yes, it's really all acrylic paint, because you'll walk through the show and everyone's like, is this glass or is it ceramic? Is it stone? What is this? But it's all acrylic paint. At the same time, yes, he was totally experimenting with unorthodox materials, especially also in the works on paper, which are not acrylic. But for example, we didn't talk about this, but he did a residency at the Xerox Corporation in 1974 and began playing around with toner, electrostatic toner powder. So that's just one example. But most medium lines, I think are kept as acrylic on canvas for brevity, because we don't actually know exactly everything that he was using. And I think he kind of liked it that way. There are other medium lines where we have verified, or others have verified, the other kinds of materials that are very evocative in their own right. And so that's absolutely part of the conversation, but it's an ongoing process. And I would say we also did at the museum just most recently the first technical analyses of a number of paintings from 74 and work on paper in our collection from 75. That's that rippled liquid space piece. So we actually we corrected the medium line in one case because we were discovering new things about what he was actually using. So I just see it as the beginning of a long and hopefully really wonderful journey into all of his, shape-shifting materials that he was using.
There's going to be modes of excavation for generations to come with those paintings. And I think that's also kind of the gift that he left behind for us, is like, what is it going to take to actually know? And even when you think you do, you don't. And that's part of the point.
David, did he talk to you?
Yes.
Specifically about, some of these materials?
Oh, sure. And
Yeah.
he was very proud of his discoveries. And he was using acrylic before almost any other painters, and using it in such a inventive and unusual way. I was young painter then, and I thought, oh, acrylic isn't as good as oil. What a mistake I made.
Amazing.
It's amazing. He was into it so early. He knew the different producers of different kinds of acrylic and really tried them all, looked for all the possibilities. It was very impressive.
I love that, David, because I still think there exists this kind of hierarchy in terms of like material. And I swear people still think oil is better than acrylic, like if it's like oil on canvas, oh, oil on canvas. Whereas if you say acrylic on, it's like, oh, acrylic,
You're right. You're right.
But he kind of corrected that course. There's one work we haven't talked about, King's Garden, which is like right before he goes into this sort of breakthrough, moment. And I suggest everyone to, find this work because it's that, like the title says, it's like this garden. It's all these colors and it's watercolors and it's so loose and free, and it's almost like he's priming himself, for the period he's about to, he's about to enter into. And I think it's just it's a really great work, and it's also it's sort of, it's more whimsical. And while he's always very loose, he's also clearly concerned with like modes and methods of architecture, and how to, build space. But this is kind of that too, but kinetically, at least how it reads visually, very different. And I think it's a great precursor in a way.
Yeah, it's amazing. And just quickly, it's part of a series of works titled King's Garden. So I believe that was number 14. But anyway, I can't remember, but they're in all different media, and they're really gorgeous. But there's a number of them as well where you see these faces coming out, and at least a number of them have actually these kind of illustrated faces, one of which really resembles Martin Luther King Jr. actually. So you see it in there.
Wow. I was wondering about if there's a reference to Martin Luther King.
Yes. Yes,
I know
definitely.
how much Jack cared about him. One day we went to Frankfurt, and it happened to be the week of Martin Luther King's birth. And there were, what would you say, little memorials to King in all of the German churches.
Wow.
Jack and I spent the morning going around looking at them all. And Jack was very moved to see this, and that the community there cared so much about Martin Luther King.
Amazing. Wow. Incredible.
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you all so much for those answers. We have two more questions. The next question is going to be from Richard. Richard, I'll give you the chance to unmute and ask directly.
Hi. First, I just wanted to thank Michelle. I was also, like Adam, really moved at the opening. I just think mostly I wish that Jack could have seen this remarkable achievement. I feel like it was so lovingly created. It was such a beautiful homage, and it felt so whole as a show, like his life, so full. So I wanted to thank you for that, and also for the wonderful room of small Gorkies at the base of the elevator, the way that bookmarked, those of us who knew walking into the show, it was already emotional, thinking, this is what started his career, and the way you bookmarked the end of the show with the piece for Gorky, how it also ended his career. Just another comment. Jack was really not only a painter's painter, but he was a teacher's teacher. I studied with him in the 80s, and he was testing out all these thoughts that stayed with me for decades. That's kind of how when 4 decades later, you're still thinking about something he said. And he set an example of how to think as an artist, which is a lot better than someone teaching you how to paint. And he also brought us to his studio, which was the most generous way that he could share, that he wasn't just talking the talk, but he walked the walk, as he always did. So I actually work in two different parts of the world. And another thing that I think I was really influenced by him was that, here's a guy who could hold his breath for several minutes, free diving to spearfish for grouper and octopus, right? And he would create a fully transformative moment in just in a single breath of this huge monumental works. And I'm wondering if you talked a little bit about, how almost delusionally driven he was, which maybe we all are. But do you see the life rhythm of his summers in Greece, while making this sort of secret group of sculptures as an important yearly rejuvenation that provided like motivation and intensity when he came back swinging so hard into his New York painting practice?
Well, I'm so impressed by the way he did that. And it was such an unusual thing to have done as an artist. I envy him and I admire him for thinking of this. It's just great. I never did anything like that, and I regret it. I know how much I've missed. I don't know what else to say. You probably know better than me.
Sounds so nice.
Adam, do you have a ritual ever of going? I mean, like a regular, yeah.
No, I don't summer in Greece. I wish. I
Me
wish.
neither.
I summer in Brooklyn.
It's
Same
not Greece, it's Crete.
Oh, I'm sorry, Crete. Sorry.
Toward Greece. So they took the bus to Crete where they were told they could. I'm not criticizing you. Everyone is confused with those names, but they couldn't afford Greece, so they went to Crete where it was cheap. And so they went for those reasons.
I think you see it as well. Absolutely. I mean, he writes about it in his journal, and it's amazing because in May, when he's about to decamp for Greece, starting in 1969, every summer through to the end of his life, so 50 plus years, at the end of that in his journal, he'll write, "Gone fishing." And then he goes away and then he comes back in September and starts writing again. So it really was treated as this break or caesura. And yet he also writes about how that time, primarily making sculptures, wooden sculptures and mixed media sculptures, but also swimming, fishing. He talks about diving for octopus and the sensation of, he talked about the first time he's in the ocean, surrounded by all sides, all water on all sides. That's like a huge moment in his life. Or when he's diving for octopus, how he can't tell which way is up. You're really deep. I've never done it, but you're in the dark, purple, deep. And so you see that in many of his works, and he writes about how his time with these experiences absolutely is core to all of his work. And it was just extraordinary. I think artists like Norman Lewis did get to visit him regularly and sort of spend time with him, Ed Clark, others, David Diao. But one thing I'll just note as well in the show here at MoMA is that we actually have an incredible actual mosaic made out of actual stone that Jack Whitten made for his house in Greece, in Crete, outside of Crete, in Agia Galini, this small town. And to make a long story short, it was excavated from there because they sold the house in Crete, sorry. And so it's temporarily here during the show in MoMA's sculpture garden, and it's of an octopus. It's actually the greatest thing ever. So I encourage you all not to miss it. But it's also fascinating to see a work that he didn't make out of the acrylic paint tiles, but he made out of actual granite and other stone tiles, and they really catch and reflect the light. And it's of this lovely, almost cartoon-like octopus that I think we should also make a children's book about. So that's a real vestige of his time in Greece as well, inspired by Cycladic art, ancient Mediterranean art. And of course, he's looking at African sculpture the whole time too.
Can I just also add like how, maybe I'm saying it because I wish this all for us, like the kind of like discipline and commitment it takes to say, like, I'm out. Like, come May, I'm out. I'll see you in September. And carving out that space, like not only for your family, for yourself, right? But also for like the deep philosophical time it, it takes to like really cultivate ideas, to give yourself the freedom, back to that, right? To be outside of the timeline or temporality of the studio space or the commitments of dinner time and meeting friends and all of these things that we love, but do kind of encroach right on our kind of intellectual questions and our like emotional connection to the world, for better or for worse. And I just think like to have a kind of self-imposed like annual, I've gone fishing, like I'll see you when I'm back, when I have some catch with me, is such a beautiful gesture. But it also takes like a hardcore like belief in the power and value of that time, that's not like on a kind of market timeline or on the demands of other people's clock on yours. And like I just, that was, you see it in the work, it comes out in the work.
I mean, he ended up building his own house there with his family, and just really, it was a very DIY experience, so to speak. But I think, imagine growing up, when he writes about this, growing up, and because of racial segregation, he can't even visit, the museum, let alone other kinds of schools or, public spaces. And then to have some kind of opening on to a global sort of oceanic experience. I think that's what Greece was to him. It opened up a whole world.
Thank you so much for that question, Richard, and thank you for those answers. The last question today is going to be from Fong. Fong, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Wow, that was amazing, NSE. Congratulations, Michelle, Sam, and Adam. Thoughtful comment, and Ina here also, and David. I was at the show with David just first thing on Saturday, and we were talking about the difference between the messenger and the prophet. In other words, we were saying that all messengers are technically prophets, but not all prophets are messengers. And we were talking about how I remember one interview I did, which probably lasted more than 2 hours. Unfortunately, the rail archives, at least 40% of them were destroyed by Sandy in 2012. So I think I lost that cassette tape. But we did talk about a lot of different things in what you mentioned earlier, Adam, about Richard Verflis. And then what you follow, Michelle, about how every single writing, occasionally he would say things like avoid it at all costs, is a very interesting in context, simply because I remember Oscar Wilde famously say once, be yourself, everyone else already taken, which is interesting because Verflis was written in 1967, and 1968, but it did not get published in Avalanche until 1971.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting to put in the context how he admired Arshil Gorky because there's a certain emotional depth that buried below the wonderful lyrical biomorphic form, especially the thin use application of the paint, the transparency. And he did all he can to confront with Gorky, but he knew that he couldn't overcome him, which is interesting to know that he somehow gave up and had to confront with de Kooning. And the confrontation of de Kooning is interesting because de Kooning was a house painter. Jack was more or less a carpenter. I mean, he worked all kind of job, while able to teach here and there. But the developer, when he make the observation about the Kooning spatula, by 1953, that first show of Sidney Janis, the woman, which basically created the whole movement of figurative expressionism. I think it's also interesting to put Jack in that context, with people like Jan Muller. Bob Thompson, by the way, is only 2 years older than Jack. I think Bob Thompson was born 37 and Jack's 39, and Bob Thompson died when he was barely 28. But in that context with that figurative expressionist painter, it's interesting. He didn't want to go all the way with that movement. I think there was a show, David, I don't know if you remember seeing it, that Paul Schimmer did it with Judith style. I think it's the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. I was in college. I remember seeing it in 1988. It's called figurative expressionism. It's very interesting.
Bob
So,
Thompson.
Bob Thompson was in it, yes. John Muller, Lester Thompson, all kind of people. Robert Beauchamp's in it, Alex Katz in it, of course, Elaine de Kooning, and so on and so forth. But my question is very simple, because in addition to figure out how to create the different from de Kooning relational gesture, by countering it with the developer, meaning it's one shot. I find that extremely innovative, in the sense that if Pollock was to claim that I wanted to find a technique that express the similar condition of where we are now with atomic bomb. This is 1951, just about the time when he began making drip painting. So that, in innovation-wise, radical innovation. He could have easily stuck with the slab painting for a good 10 years. Why did he shift and remove from that body of work? I mean, David has been doing it as long as I know David with his work. So that kind of radical need to change, to me, it's mind-boggling. It's so impressive to walk away something that he could easily stuck with, and then move into the mosaic. By the way, I just want to compliment you on the word text, Michelle. I love the simplicity, the reference to race, to technology, to jazz, love, and war. And I say everything that what Jack is undertook all his life, But the idea of creating the Tessera painting is a very radical innovation. So there are moments that you can see and put in the context of the much broader picture. Actually, David and I was thinking about Kiefer, looking at the last painting, and why one is so literal, bombastic in his monumentality, or at least monumental approach to historicism, Hegelian manner, where Jack is doing the opposite, where the content, the personal spontaneity is completely embodied in the work. And I guess I don't have any question.
Like Fung, I can tell you love Kiefer.
Well, Adam, we're about to interview him, so let's not say anything about that. Everybody contribute differently. No, but I want to also mention the aspects of his implicit, subtle political connotation. Because in 2007, when I did that show, I was going to curate a show, a broader context of Jack's show. But when I went to the studio, I saw New York Battleground painting.
Yeah.
And he wanted to share with me how much he was so active during the anti-protest war in Vietnam, along with his activism, civil rights movement. So upon seeing that painting, when he showed me, I immediately wanted September 11 as a mirror painting for that show at MoMA PS1.
Yeah.
So that to show you, even when it's no longer explicit, the last September 11 is a very explicit painting.
Yeah.
It's a pyramid behind the $1 bill, the eye of the god, and it's really a very important critique of capitalism. And so I just want to.
Well, I think that the continual innovation prong too was a critique of capitalism, one could argue.
Yeah.
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 Mhm.
He
That
avoided
is,
a stable style. Yeah.
yeah, that if is and then of course raises the question of, is value a fixed position? And if
Mm-hmm.
it is, how do you pivot and why do you pivot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
True. It's
I,
true.
I I also think that there's something here that the kind of continuum around this question of like construction and as both a kind of material question, a process question, but deeply political and social question, right? Like if you end the show and you kind of go back to start from one, I know you can see this preoccupation with the construction of value, the construction of time, construction of history, of
Mm-hmm.
experience, and how, like, as an artist, he's exploring that question of construction, like through a constant return to tools, to device, to process, to color, to others, right? Like, back to this idea that so many of his paintings are dedications, are nods, are citations, are engaging in this very kind of collective reflection of the self, that one's construction of self is very much collective. It's not only made by yourself, which is core, but it's made by people you know and people you don't, people who have made the world for you or against you. And part of the responsibility is also about constructing something for whoever comes next.
It's true. It's true. Yeah, I want to make my last few paragraphs, few sentences here, just because it's a loaded retrospective. You can't really unpack in one visit. This is my second visit, and I'm intending to go back this Saturday first thing.
Oh, great.
I will continue to do so. It's very wonderfully installed, but it just brings up so many questions. The question I have for now is his own contribution to the abstraction, to the language of abstraction. I think it's very huge. I think the time when he decided not to pursue full-heartedly to the figurative expressionist ethos, I think that's important to know, that he committed to abstraction, the freedom of abstraction. I remember talking to Julie Moretu about this, and same apply with my lengthy conversation with our friend Stanley Whitney. Jack represents an amazing inspiration for people like Stanley, who after the rupture of, Black Lives Matters, and I asked what he had been doing, and he say, I paint right through civil rights movement, through the Vietnam War, I paint through the Iraq War, and I will paint through Black Lives Matter. It's so interesting to know that, because that's when the time when Jack decided to move to New York in the fall of 1960 and stop being involved in full activism in civil rights movement. I think you need to sometime allow that kind of space for some of our artists who can express a certain manner, more subtle in their own work, not conform and pressure them to be on the street to get involved. So I just want to bring that freedom and abstraction. So I got to think about that and then come back to the show. Multitude more. I don't type, Adam, let's meet. Let's meet. I mean, Richard, you want to come? You can meet. I'm sure David and I will be meeting every week. So thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I was just going to say that your show with 9/11 and New York Battleground was obviously such an incredible landmark, and it sort of says it all, right? Which is that from the beginning toward the end of his career, it's not that there was not a false divide between form and content. He was always addressing the most searing sort of aspects of our lived experience, but he was just doing it in new ways that it kind of took us a long time, I think, to grasp actually, as well. And I would just say that the other, actually, even in addition to Sarah's verb list, he was actually looking at Ad Reinhardt, right? Because Reinhardt's no list, like all of Reinhardt, that actually was also very specifically something that was impacting him. And so I think when you look at Jack Whitten's things to avoid at all costs, or like so many other lists, it's not just about freedom per se, it's also about negation and critique, and somehow he folds those all in together. It's actually not one or the other.
Yeah, it's so true. That's so true. Correspondent me once say the artist is not a special kind of man, but every man is a special kind of artist. And I think that's where Jack fit in. His humanity is luminally large. Thank you.
Thank you.
Back to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Fong. And thank you again, David, Sam, Adam, and Michelle. I want to pass the microphone over to David and Michelle for some short readings, and then we'll conclude today. David, do you want to go first?
I guess I'll go first. I was going to say, I was on the phone with Jack once, and he was telling me about a painting he was working on and having a lot of difficulty with. So he said it was like riding a bucking bronco. And it's such a beautiful image. The painting had its own life and its own things it wanted to do, not what Jack wanted to do. And how does he find a way to ride that bucking bronco? He put it so beautifully. It was a great conversation.
Amazing.
And I like the cowboy imagery too. That fits Jack very well.
That's amazing. And it segues into, again, as you all know, there are just 1,000 million quotes that he's endlessly quotable, but this I've just been finding, very inspiring these days. And it's a quote where he says, "Painters are the psychic canaries in the coal mine. We know which way the fumes are blowing. My advice to young painters: learn to hold your ground, be honest with yourselves, embrace the history of painting, and I promise you, you'll never be alone."
That's such a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Michelle and David, for those readings. And thank you all again for your conversation today. Thank you to the team at MoMA for providing some of those views that we were able to look at today during the conversation. Thank you to Jessica at Adam's studio and Elisa at David's studio for their support in making today's event possible. I'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsors the New Social Environment and makes conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive on YouTube, where you'll be able to watch this shortly. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for a conversation with Sarah Fox and Gabby Collins-Fernandez on the occasion of Auto Friction on view at Hales Gallery. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you again soon.
Long live Jack.
Thank you.
Oh, we
Thank
Jack
you so much.
Whitten!
Thank
Bye.
you.
Michelle!
Michelle, thank you, Adam. Thank you,
Diana.
thank you, David.
Thank you, Adam.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
And thank you, Richard.
Thank you all.
Thank you
Somewhere.
so much.
Congratulations. Hello, long live Jack Whitten.
Thank you.
Yay. Go see the show, you guys, please. Congratulations, Michelle.
Hi.
This was all very moving.
Congrats, Francesca. Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.